So a lot of shoulder problems actually have nothing to do with the shoulder at all. And that's because when you move your arm, there's a ton of joints that must work together in unison to allow you to move well, pain-free, and produce force. If you don't understand how each of these joints within the shoulder complex work, then your shoulder gains will be totally whack. We're gonna dive into the biomechanics behind this complex and what you can do to improve them so that way you move better, have less pain, and get freaky strong. Let's first break down some of the big joints within the shoulder complex. The first one is the big dog, the glenohumeral joint. It involves two bones, the scapula. That's where the gleno portion comes in. So the glenoid is this hole right here on your scapula or shoulder blade. And the humerus, where the humeral comes in the glenohumeral joint. Now, these bones articulate just like so. And I want you to pay attention to these rough patches right here. This is called the greater and lesser tubercle. When these bones move, they move in opposite directions. This is called relative motion, meaning two segments can move independently of one another. If I move the humerus out into external rotation, you'll notice that the tubercles move away from the front of the glenoid. I can do the same thing if I internally rotate the scapula. So that is the relative motion between these two joints. If the humerus externally rotates, the scapula internally rotates. It's the same relationship. You need to know how external rotation works because that affects a ton of motions at the shoulder. Aside from me externally rotating my arm, that rotation also occurs with shoulder flexion, raising the arm overhead, as well as shoulder abduction, raising the arm out to the side. Any of those movements involve external rotation. We're now going to talk about the other relative motion that happens here, which is internal rotation. If I internally rotate the humerus, you'll notice that those tubercles now move closer to the front of the glenoid. This creates external rotation of the scapula. So internal rotation of the humerus and external rotation of the scapula are the relative motions between these two segments. Humeral internal rotation is important with movements that involve extension of the shoulder, so think rows, as well as adduction, whether that's coming across the middle, like in a chest press of any kind, or even inward towards the midline like this. Building upon how the scapula influences what the arm does, we have to look at one of the most important joints, the scapulothoracic joint. This involves the articulation of your shoulder blade on the rib cage, and it's related directly to those two rotations that I talked about with the humerus. So we talked about how humeral external rotation creates scapular internal rotation. Let's see how this influences the rib cage, which is part of the scapulothoracic joint. Here's a rib cage here. If I internally rotate the scapula, you'll notice that the medial border, the inside, moves away from the rib cage, just like this. Now your scapula runs from about T2 to T7, meaning the motions that happen here will influence the upper part of the thorax. And so if the scapula is moving away from the thorax, when I externally rotate the humerus, that's going to increase space in your upper back. Now this space needs to fill with something. And so what happens is the ribs move backwards and upwards as the lungs expand with air. This is called posterior upper thorax expansion. It involves predominantly the upper ribs moving back and up. That is the motion that happens within the scapulothoracic joint. When more airflow is going into the back of the rib cage, there is going to be less airflow into the front. So you have more muscle activity pushing the sternum down, which allows more of the air to go into the upper back. The mechanics differ when we're talking about humeral internal rotation and scapular external rotation though. When I internally rotate the humerus, the scapula externally rotates. What that does to the rib cage is now the inside border of the scapula compresses or goes right up against the upper back. If that space is now closed, there's less ability for air to go into the upper back. It's got to go somewhere else. If the scapula is approximating against the upper back and muscles are more tense back here, that drives more air to the front. This expands the front part of the chest wall. We're going to call this anterior upper thorax expansion because, again, most of the shoulder blade's functions influence the upper part of the rib cage. So you'll see the chest rise forward and upward like so. Now, it's not the whole rib cage lifting like this. It's more the sternum moving up and down. So with the scapula pressing up against the rib cage, you see the front of the sternum move forward and upward. That's during inhalation, and then it goes down and back during exhalation. And that's why improving your breathing dynamics can have such a massive impact on how the shoulder blade and shoulder functions, because the rib cage is essentially the foundation at which the shoulder girdle sits upon. Now, that's not the only joint that's influenced by breathing. There's a couple other joints of the shoulder complex. One of the most underrated ones that people don't talk about is the sternoclavicular joint, or SC joint for sure. This joint, which involves your collarbone, predominantly works when you're first initially raising your arm up, although motion happens throughout. As I raise the arm up overhead, you see a couple things happen at this joint. What will occur is the collarbone will elevate upwards, and it also rotates backwards, more posteriorly. And as I go fully overhead, you'll see this part of the joint come backwards or retract, which is a movement that is this direction here. And so my ability to move this is going to have a major influence on the rib cage as well. Since the SC joint attaches right at the top part of the sternum, called the manubrium, you'll see a lot of the motion affecting the first and second rib. So the highest amount of expansion within this area has a direct effect on the sternoclavicular joint. And the last joint that we're going to talk about, which links all of these areas together, is the AC joint, or the acromioclavicular joint. The AC joint involves the attachment of the collarbone to the scapula or shoulder blade. This creates various rotations as I move the arm up overhead, and although the movement is small, it is important. And the way we can talk about how each of these bones move is by looking at something called scapulohumeral rhythm. What scapulohumeral rhythm is basically for a certain amount of motion at the humerus when I move my arm, right, the shoulder, there's motion that happens at the shoulder blade as well as the other joints. And of course, rib cage expansion changes as I'm moving my arm. Most research shows that this ratio is from 2:1 to 5:1, depending on the person, meaning for every 2 to 5 degrees of motion at the shoulder, there's going to be 1 degree of motion at the scapula. And that scapular motion can only happen if there's enough movement at the AC joint, there's enough movement at the SC joint, and I'm creating the expansion that I need in the rib cage, so that way the shoulder blade stays nice and congruent or plastered up against the ribs as I raise my arm up and down overhead. In general, there's a lot of stuff that should happen as we go overhead. Now, because overhead motion is related to flexion or abduction, we see an overwhelming bias toward external rotation. Now, the amount that's happening changes because of some alterations in the mechanics of the shoulder blade, but we'll go into that later. When it comes to the scapula, this bad boy has to continue to move upward so there's adequate space within the glenohumeral joint. Otherwise, you're going to get pinching and nastiness. What happens here as I raise the arm overhead is the scapula upwardly rotates, it externally rotates, and it posteriorly tilts. Now, you would think, because of the external rotation at the scapula, that might actually cause the humerus to internally rotate, right? Well, the reason why it doesn't per se is because, remember, the humerus is moving more than the scapula, one, and you also have to look at the other motions that are happening at the shoulder blade. As I raise my arm up overhead, the scapula is going to slide out to the side, like so. When it slides in this direction, it changes the orientation of the glenoid. So as I raise my arm up, the scapula kind of slides along the outside of the rib cage. If I raise the rib cage and the scapula up, it kind of looks like internal rotation, doesn't it? Because the glenoid is pointing more inward. Even though the motion is external rotation, that's sliding along the side of the rib cage still creates an overall bias at the scapulothoracic joint toward internal rotation. So those are the general movements that we're going to see at the humerus and the scapula. Let's now talk about the SC and the AC joint. When I raise my arm overhead, the SC joint is going to elevate, it's going to retract or get pulled backward and rotate posteriorly, which would be this direction right here. And basically the AC joint kind of fine-tunes scapular positioning. There's subtle rotations that happen throughout arm elevation, but it really depends on what rotation and rate is happening at the SC joint and the scapulothoracic joint. Now those motions are in general. We can break down some subtle differences that happen at each of these joints even further by looking at the 3 distinct phases of shoulder flexion: 0 to 60, 60 to 120 degrees, and 120 to 180. Let's first talk about 0 to 60 degrees. When I raise the arm in this range, most of the movement is humeral, and it's biased toward external rotation. And remember, if I have external rotation at the humerus, that's going to get me relative scapular internal rotation. If I have internal rotation of the scapula, that creates space between the scapula and the rib cage, which has to fill. That's going to bias posterior upper rib cage expansion. Now from 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, the rest of the shoulder complex has to start picking up the slack. Otherwise, you're going to get some bumping in the top of the shoulder joint. You don't want that. That's kind of uncomfortable. Now, throughout this range, the humerus is continually externally rotating. However, the amount of external rotation in this range slows because of one joint. In order to allow for smooth overhead movement, the scapula must stay plastered up against the thorax. As I raise my arm up and the scapula begins to upwardly rotate, we have to have that inner border press up against the thorax. That pressing that you're seeing in this area is scapular external rotation. As you'll recall, scapular external rotation is related to shoulder or humeral internal rotation. Now, that doesn't mean that the humerus is maximally internally rotated at this point. It's just that the amount of external rotation that's happening is slowing. You want to think about the motion in this range as kind of like I'm continuing to walk forward, but the speed at which I walk forward slows. So think of 0 to 60 degrees of shoulder flexion as this. I'm walking forward towards you, externally rotating, minding my own business. Then I hit 60 degrees to 120. I'm still moving toward you, but slower because of the scapular external rotation. Whew, all right, enough of that walk. Now you're probably wondering what's going on with the thorax if the scapula is externally rotating. Well, if the scapula is externally rotating, now that space between the inside border of the scapula and the rib cage is closing down. So there's going to be less air going into the upper back. More of the air is going to go into the chest. You'll also see some movement in the back part of the ribs that are below the scapula. And that's because the diaphragm has to come up a little bit, so that way there's less air going into the upper back. And what that does is that creates a mobilization within to the lower part of the thorax, or the posterior lower portion of the thorax. Now, from 120 all the way up to 180, the humerus is maximally externally rotating. We're also seeing the shoulder blade continue to move forward into upward rotation, but you'll see that it starts to orient more inward towards the scapular plane. Because of this, that drives even further humeral external rotation. And again, if there's humeral external rotation, that means the scapula is moving more away from the midline. There's more space for the upper part of the thorax in the back to fill with air. And because of that, there's less air going into the front of the chest. But what does happen is as I raise my arm up overhead, we see movement of the diaphragm more so in the front coming up. So that creates some movement in the lower part of the ribs in the front. Now, also important is shoulder extension, which is about 45 to 60 degrees depending on the person. For this motion, the humerus must internally rotate in the beginning, and then it externally rotates towards the end. When this happens, the scapular shoulder blade has to tip forward. This forward tip is called anterior tilt. This is going to have an influence at the SC joint. When you extend and the scapula tips forward, we see the SC joint depress or drop down and rotate anteriorly. You'll also see some slight retraction here. When you have this motion here, you get expansion into the uppermost segment of the front part of the thorax. And that's because when I anteriorly tilt the scapula, there is some degree of scapular external rotation. That's also due to the humeral internal rotation that happens in the beginning of shoulder extension. Now, the big takeaway with all those mechanics is this: the shoulder girdle has to stay congruent as possible along the rib cage. And the way that that happens is the rib cage has to change its shape by airflow to allow that to happen. It basically creates space for the shoulder blade, the SC joint, and more to move along the ribs as you raise your arm and move it throughout space. But what if the shape of the rib cage doesn't allow for that? What if there's restriction somewhere in here because of too much muscle activity? Well, that's going to affect how your shoulder moves. For example, you've probably seen as someone raises their arm overhead, the shoulder blade wing. But is it really winging? What if it's because the thorax can't expand and it's sitting far forward in relationship to where the shoulder blade is? Well, of course, this is going to look like it wings. Or you ever see someone who's got a really proud chest, shoulder blades are down and back, arms are way behind them? Well, that could be a scenario where the shoulder blade is plastered up against the thorax, and because of increased muscle tension in this area, there can't be good movement. And because of that, you can see that the rib cage is really the foundation of most shoulder mobility issues and performance. If you can't create the space and shape needed in the rib cage, the scapula, the SC joint, the AC joint won't have a foundation to move along. So when I test shoulder motion with patients and clients, I'm not really looking at the shoulder. It's giving me a proxy measure for how the thorax can expand. Because, as we had seen, when I do a particular rotation at the arm, there has to be rotations that happen at the shoulder blade and at the collarbone. And in order for those rotations to happen, you need to have expansion somewhere in the thorax. These are some of the key tests that I look at and what each tells me. The first is shoulder external rotation at 0 degrees of abduction. Because the arm is at your side, most of the expansion is going to happen in the uppermost segments. It tells me the most about how posterior upper thorax expands. Next is Apley's internal rotation. Because the arm is going behind you, it's an internal rotation-based measure. The arm going backwards means you must have expansion forward. This tells me about expansion in the uppermost segments of the front of the thorax, or anterior upper thorax expansion. After that, I look at rotation at 90 degrees of abduction. Shoulder external rotation at 90 degrees of abduction biases expansion into 2 areas. Again, the posterior upper thorax, but I'm also going to get a little bit of movement in the lower part of the front ribs, or anterior lower. Expansion in these 2 areas happens along a diagonal. The more the posterior upper thorax expands with air, the more the anterior lower part of the thorax expands or fills with the abdominal contents or guts. We'll also look at shoulder internal rotation at 90 degrees. This gives me an appreciation for expansion in 2 areas: the anterior upper part of the thorax, but also the posterior lower. These 2 areas expand together. If the anterior upper, or the front of the chest, fills with air, the back lower, which is below the shoulder blade, that's going to fill with the abdominal contents. And the last move that I look at is shoulder flexion, going completely overhead. If you can bring your arm up fully overhead, that means everything below that fills. Most of the expansion or movement is going to be biased towards the anterior lower part of the thorax. Now, when I look at all these tests, I don't look at, oh, this test is limited, we got to do that. And then after we've done that, then we got to look at this test and then address that. No. What I do is I look at all of those tests as one cluster. And the combination of test results gives me some information about where we need to create space in the thorax so the shoulder can move with ease. The easiest one to see is the one that I affectionately call, bruh, you hella stiff. This person is limited in all tests. You can also have someone who's got more of an arched posture. You're this if you're limited at shoulder external rotation at 0 degrees, shoulder flexion, and shoulder internal rotation at 90 degrees. Next, the slouched person, aka the person who's been playing World of Warcraft for 36 hours, double fisting Mountain Dews. I see you. This is you if you're limited shoulder external rotation at 0 degrees and flexion, but also shoulder external rotation at 90 degrees. And last, but certainly not least, is the person who's asymmetrical, who has one shoulder lower than the other, or really a thorax that is side bent in one direction. This is you if your measures are legitimately asymmetrical, meaning you got full external rotation on one side, full internal rotation on the other, and then vice versa with the limitations, meaning one side's limited in internal, the other is limited in external. Now that you know the possibilities, let's look at some strategies that we can apply to improve dynamics in each one of them so we improve shoulder function. The person who's hella stiff has tons of muscle activity, especially in the front and back of the rib cage. When this is tight, it creates a squeezing force into the thorax. When the thorax has this squeezing force, it actually kind of flattens it out and limits your ability to rotate. So we have to do things that open up the front and back dimensions so we can improve overall rotation. The 3 things that I do to achieve this are reducing overall muscle activity. The way we can do this is by moving very slowly and controlled and producing as little tension as possible. You can also do strategies that compress the sides of the rib cage, because if I squeeze the sides, the front and back dimensions will get bigger. You can use overpressure, blocks, or even your side musculature, such as your serratus anterior and obliques. Think side plank exercises. And the last thing that I do is try to expand the thoracic inlet. So when I talk about the inlet, I'm talking about the upper part of the rib cage. I will oftentimes use collarbone pulls or things of that nature to open up the front and back dimensions. Now, the collarbone is not going to move, but when I create that separating action, it creates more space in the uppermost part of the thorax. This is the first place that has to fill, because if it's tight up top, you essentially get a reverse funneling effect. If the airway or the space in this area is small, you can't really create good expansion below. It's like drinking through a straw. We want to blow that straw open. For the arched person, we want to target 2 areas, the posterior lower thorax and the anterior upper part of the thorax. More of the bias will be to the posterior lower, meaning we're going to have to do things that are going to be out in front of us, because if my arm goes out in front, I have to shift my weight or I have to create more space backwards. Things that I like are reaching from 90 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, but you want to bias the arm towards external rotation, because if you're the arched person, you're going to have a limitation in internal rotation. You can look at it this way. If I internally rotate my arm, but then I flare my ribs up like so, you can see that the amount of IR that I am presenting with is less. You can bias external rotation by going with palms up, bending the elbows, or not weight bearing through the arms. Now for the slouched person, we first have to reduce front side muscle activity. This is pulling the sternum down. That's going to limit how well this space is going to be able to open up. The key muscle that we'll be focusing on for this is rectus damn near Cildus abdominis. Then, once we've gotten that better, which will be manifested by improved external rotation at 90 degrees, then we're going to go after filling the upper back, or the posterior upper thorax. To get the rectus to chillax, I like starting face down or prone, using diagonal movements, and doing prone press-ups. All of this is going to elongate that muscle, allowing it to relax. Then, to drive expansion into the upper back, we're going to use low reaches in the 0 to 60 range, making sure that we don't crunch as we do it, as well as cross-connect activities. And the last category is the asymmetrical presentation, which is really a side bend of the thorax. So if we are side bent one way, we're basically going to work on side bending the other way. But we don't want to just do this and then force everything the other direction. We have to bias airflow accordingly, so that way we have segmental motion happening in the rib cage, which is going to lead to segmental motion happening in the shoulder, the scapulothoracic joint, and more. So if I'm side bent to the right, I want to make sure that I compress the left side of the rib cage and open up the right side. You also want to drive rotational movements with this particular individual, and you can bias that by doing certain reaches depending on which side. Again, let's say the right side is down, or is the side that's side bent down, and the left side is the high side. On the closed side, which would be the right, I'm going to drive low reaches. And then on the side that sits high, I'm going to drive reaches within the middle range of shoulder flexion, 60 to 120 degrees. Now you can see with a lot of these movements, we've really been talking about driving expansion and mobility within the rib cage, because that is the foundation of the shoulder. If you'd like to learn more about that, I would check out this video right here, as it goes into even more depth with how we can improve dynamics within this key area.